Hi, my name is Chris, and today I'm going to talk about the Atomos Ninja V, the monitor and recorder that I have been using for a couple of weeks now for the production of these videos. In this video, I'm going to go over a couple of the things that I found throughout the week, also a couple things that you might want to know about the Atomos Ninja V if you are thinking of investing in a piece of gear like this. Also, how you might want to gear up around it because you can't really just use it the way that it comes to you. And all of this is considering me from a kind of like a YouTuber / podcast maker perspective. That's kind of like the outlook that I'm going to give you here. However, I'm also going to kind of like touch on what this means for other filmmaker types. I'm going to split part of this video into a second video that you will find on my YouTube channel a couple days after this one, and I'm also going to link that in the description below, where I'm specifically going to talk about the mix or the pairing between the Canon EOS R with the Atomos Ninja V and the available codecs, as well as recording times and such things. I might just touch on certain aspects of that in this video, but then I will have more of the test results of different quality settings and such things. I will have that in a separate video, and you will find that on my YouTube channel. If you want to learn more about topics like these, you can always leave questions in the comment section below. And of course, also like these videos for the algorithm and also for me to know what you enjoy and what I might want to make more of. Now, all those things out of the way, I have a couple things that I want to mention first. First off, I'm not affiliated with Canon or Atomos at all. I have purchased all the gear that I'm talking about from my own money, and I'm just talking about this because I myself find videos like these very helpful in the process of deciding whether or not I want to purchase a certain piece of equipment. So what I'm doing here is just for your information. If you actually decide that this may make sense for you, maybe certain pieces of equipment or the Atomos Ninja V, as well as all the kinds of the accessories, then the links in the description are going to point you to Amazon. Those links are affiliate links as always, and I get a small commission from that, and it doesn't change anything for the price for you. So that really helps out my channel. Then I also want to mention that this video is not going to be perfect all around because I'm looking at this from my perspective as a YouTuber and upcoming podcast creator, and there are certain features that I look for that someone creating a commercial or, for example, using this as a monitor for a client shoot or similar things will not look for, or other way around, they might not care about the things that I care about. So this is going to be from my perspective and the things that I noticed around this monitor, but I hope it will still be massively helpful for you. And last but not least, I want to mention that the version number that I am recording this with is the Atomos Ninja V version 10.2, and also the Canon EOS R is in version 1.4.0. So now you know what kind of like the time frame we are talking about here. And with that, let's jump into the real video and opening up the box and seeing what's inside. When you open the box as it comes to you, there are a couple things inside, and mainly you open it up and you immediately see the Atomos Ninja V monitor / recorder. And as you go further, you actually find a battery adapter as well as a power cable and wall outlet adapters for different countries, which I personally really appreciate because what I'm doing with this recorder for the most part is that I am actually using it in my studio where I actually have a power source ready and available. Another thing that I really like is that the cord and the adapter are not connected to each other, and you can actually unscrew that, which means that you can also use other power supplies with that battery adapter. So that makes it really powerful to be able to power all of this, for example, with a V-mount battery if you rig it up to some kind of a shoulder camera rig or similar things. The next thing that you find in the box as well is a SSD caddy, and this is actually just a housing for the SSD that you can then put into the recorder to record your footage onto. This SSD caddy you will have to then fill with your own SSD. One thing about this caddy is that it actually sticks out the side of the Atomos Ninja V because it is actually the previous version, so to say, and it's made for bigger monitors. And now they actually have mini drives or mini SSD caddies as well. However, they also cost more money, and you kind of have to change your SSD to kind of like fit in there. There are videos on YouTube that you can find about that, and you can even 3D print your own SSD caddy. But for me right now, I have found that I'm just going to use this one because for the most part, as I mentioned, I'm in the studio. I use one drive and one drive only. For me, this is enough, but you might have to invest in more of these, and they actually can cost around $50 just for these plastic housings so that your SSD is locked in place in the Atomos Ninja V. And last one, you get a quick start guide. And that actually kind of wraps it up what you will find in the box of the Atomos Ninja V. However, you need a couple more things to actually make this a system that works from that point forward. Number one would be that you actually need an HDMI cable. And there are a couple things that you have to keep in mind there. For one, you have to make sure to actually get a cable that fits both your camera and the Atomos Ninja V, which means on the Atomos Ninja V, a full-sized HDMI port, and on your camera, it can be a micro, maybe a mini, or it can be a standard-sized HDMI port. So you want to check that, and based on that, make your purchase of an HDMI cable. There are all kinds of cables on the market, from threaded ones to long ones to short ones. And for my personal use, I have found that I have one long HDMI cable with an adapter on one end to actually fit the mini HDMI port from the Canon EOS R going to the Atomos Ninja V, and that is to mount the monitor actually a little further away from the camera. And then I also have one cord that is HDMI mini to HDMI standard sized, and that I use when I actually put the monitor on top of the camera so that there are no long cables hanging around. These cables can be quite cheap, and I actually have found that the Amazon Basic cables work quite nicely. The monitor comes with a wall plug adapter, and that's really handy. However, if you want to use the whole setup on the go, you might also want to invest in some NPF style batteries as well as an NPF style charger. For myself, I once more took care of actually choosing one that supports USB-C types charging as well as charging two batteries at the same time. And in this case, I am using the NPF 960 or 970 style batteries. And in my setup, I found that these actually last for about 2 hours of recording in 1080p ProRes LT. Another complaint that I have read online is that there is no pouch, no case, no nothing for this monitor. Some people actually prefer to put this monitor into a cage to house it and be more durable. However, I have found that this monitor itself is quite durable. The only thing that I don't really like about this is when I travel, that the screen, the touch panel, is actually exposed, and I really have to be careful with that, either wrapping it with something, or maybe in the future I might get a small pouch for it so that that's more protected. I also checked for certain screen protectors for the Atomos Ninja V. However, in the reviews, most of them say that they don't really stick that well because it actually becomes quite hot, and especially if you're working outside in summer, this doesn't really work out that well. So I opted for not protecting the screen at all and just being careful. Then, of course, you need a hard drive if you want to use the recording ability of the Atomos Ninja V. And for that, I actually got the Western Digital 3D NAND 500GB drive, and that one cost me about 50 euros or something like that. And for pretty much all that I am doing right now with the studio recordings as well as planning podcast recordings, it is completely enough. However, this also depends on the quality codec that you want to record. And this drive actually is on the supported page from Atomos, which you may want to check depending on which drive you're looking at, but it may not record ProRes RAW, for example. So you might want to check those out. But overall, ProRes HQ is no problem in 4K 60 with this drive. So all of that is set up there. However, you also have to be mindful that the files, depending on which quality level you are recording at, whether it's 4K, 1080p, or something in the ProRes LT, ProRes HQ, and those things, you might want to make sure that you get a drive that is big enough to actually handle your stuff. However, that's a topic that I'm going to address later in the video, as well as in the upcoming video where I talk more about the codecs as well as the storage used by those codecs. And with the ability to record to SSD drives, you also have to invest into a little adapter from SATA 3 to USB-C or USB-A depending on your setup. For me, I use a MacBook Pro from about 2017 with all USB-C ports, so I like to go for the USB-C versions, and they are also quite fast. That is one big plus side here. However, you have to get one. And I found that the Atomos version of this is actually quite bulky, and I don't really like that. And it's also quite expensive. These ones go around 10 to 20 euros, and that's pretty much enough for whatever you want to do with it. And for me, that was a great choice. And the last additional gear item that I want to mention is a kind of like a small rig swivel mount for the hot shoe of your camera of some sorts. Because the monitor itself actually has two screws for tripod mounts and such things. However, if you want to mount the monitor onto your camera, into the hot shoe mount, for example, you have to look for some way to do that. And also, to be able to swivel it around and have it the angle that is actually necessary, you have to kind of invest in something like that. Those swivel mounts go for anywhere between 10 and 40 or 30 euros. So depending on what you want to get, you might check out those as well. So now, having talked about the gear itself, maybe it is actually interesting to talk about the benefits and also why I chose to invest into this piece of equipment. And for that, I want to talk about the benefits of having an extra monitor on set first. Some of these aspects are pretty much for any monitor. However, there's also a big difference whether you get one monitor for like 40 or 50 euros to just have a bigger screen, or even have a swivel screen at all if you want to shoot on a camera that does not provide you with that. However, a high quality monitor like the Atomos Ninja V gives you a couple more things that you might not have in cheaper monitor versions. The first thing that always comes to mind is that this type of monitor actually provides you with more analytical features. Some of those include the waveforms, the zebras, the false color for brightness kind of judging, as well as vector scopes for white balance, as well as color judgments, focus assist and peaking features, aspect ratio preview, the de-squeezing if you have an anamorphic lens going, and some more. So those are really, really cool features, and for myself, I actually noticed myself learning about them as I now use this monitor, and that actually helps quite a lot if you're shooting something like Z-log or some kind of log profile and you want to get the correct exposure. With these helpful tools, you actually can judge much better, especially with cameras like the EOS R that does not have that built in. Next, you also have a really, really high brightness monitor. The Atomos Ninja V actually has 1000 nits, which is quite powerful even if you are working outside. Now, for the studio use, as I'm having it right now, it may not be that interesting. However, if you're going on location and working outside a lot, that may be really, really helpful. With that, the monitor is also bigger, which makes it much easier for me to see even though it may be far away. Right now, I have it about 2 arm's lengths from me to still be able to see very, very well whether or not I'm in focus, especially with those analytical tools that I mentioned before as well, with focus peaking and those red lines and those kind of things. But it's not just bigger, it can also be away from the camera. Of course, you can mount it into the hot shoe mount of your camera or somehow rig it to your whole setup. However, you can also move it away with a longer HDMI cord, and if you have a wireless setup, you can even use that to have that monitor further away and maybe even use it with a client as a monitor that they can see what the camera sees and such things. So it has a really good versatility, and not just that, it also gives you the ability to actually have a monitor facing you if you are using a camera that does not have a flippy screen, for example. And to close this section of the monitor features, this also has LUT previews, which means that, for example, for me, I can use my standard LUT that I always use for my Canon EOS R footage. I can load that onto the monitor and then preview my C-Log footage already with that LUT applied. However, record without the LUT. I'm recording C-Log, but I'm actually looking at that profile that is already applied to the LUT, and I can actually use that feature as well as all the other features of having punch in as well as focus peaking and also the vector scopes. I can use all of these features while recording. I can also use them while looking at the monitor without recording, and I can use them in playback when I have recorded something and I want to check whether or not I peaked something or those kind of things. So overall, it is a really, really nice monitor. But the really interesting part about the setup for myself was not necessarily the monitor functionality. However, it is really, really nice to have that. But it actually is about the recording features. That's why I actually invested into this piece of equipment. So let's go over these aspects of this recorder and look at why that makes sense. One of the main things that I hate about mirrorless cameras, as well as DSLRs when I had those previously, is that they have these 30-minute caps of recording, which don't really have anything to do with the hardware, but are kind of this tax problem that is out there. And I do know that there are certain cameras, like the Panasonic cameras, that have gone around this, and they are actually doing the limitless recording and such things. But for the Canon EOS R, it is still there, and I have no idea why, but it's still what we have to work with. So wanting to record longer takes, as well as wanting to, for example, record podcast episodes of conversations of like an hour or something like that, I had to search for a solution how I can do that without actually restarting the camera and with that disrupting my process or the interview. And now with this monitor, I can actually do this. It doesn't really have any recording limit except for the battery lifetime if you use batteries. However, you can get around this with using the power plug, and also the recording limits on the hard drive depending on how much space you have and which codec you use to record with. And thus, this recorder can actually record more than 30 minutes, even though your camera may not be able to do so. However, there are two things that you have to be aware of. Number one is that you might want to have your camera actually set up to be able to do that, and for example, disable any kind of auto shutoff or something like that. I already have a video about this, specifically talking about live streaming. However, the settings kind of apply here as well to set all of the other things as the maximum. For example, the internal screen shouldn't turn off. However, we can only set that to 30 minutes with the Canon EOS R. You also might want to set the auto shut off of the camera to never occur, so you can actually still see everything and work with everything while you are working with this monitor as well as the recording features. Another really important part is that you can actually use the HDMI timecode features to start and stop recording whenever you hit the record button on the camera, so that the monitor also records automatically. However, there's a big caveat, which is that then the camera internal limit of 30 minutes actually also applies to the external recording of the HDMI port. So you don't want to do that. What you do want to do, if you want to record for more than 30 minutes, you actually want to start the recording on the monitor, which means that you don't record two files. You actually are only recording on the monitor and not with the camera. And so the camera actually kind of works independently. And that is also one part where you want to make sure that the camera does not shut off, even though the monitor, for example, might go off after 30 minutes because that's the maximum that we can set it for. However, you still have the bigger monitor, the Atomos, to record for more than 30 minutes, and that's going to stay on during the entire time and just record the HDMI output. So make sure that you're not starting the recording with the camera record button if you want to record for more than 30 minutes. Now let's talk about the codecs that you can record with this recorder and why that is interesting. For the most part, I feel like the recorder is kind of focused on recording ProRes files in 4:2, LT, HQ, as well as just the standard 4:2. And you can even go to ProRes 4:2 RAW if you have a camera that supports it. For example, the Nikon Z6 as well as the C7. This recorder also can record DNxHR. However, you actually have to activate the setting, which doesn't really cost anything, but it is a couple more steps to do rather than just recording ProRes like it is. To activate the DNxHR settings, you actually just go onto the monitor, you choose the DNxHR, and the first time you do that, you will be asked to go to a website, create a code for yourself, and then enter that code on the monitor. So that is all just easy peasy. However, it's a couple more steps. For me, I don't really use any Windows products, and all my editing is done on Mac OS, so I'm really good with ProRes, and that's pretty much what I actually wanted to have. And with using this monitor and the recording features around it, you actually also get a new feature on the Canon EOS R, which is 10-bit 4:2 in 4K recording, which the camera cannot do internally, but it can do it with the external output. So having these codecs available is really helpful in multiple ways. The main way that I really like about it is that ProRes is much nicer to edit on my computer, and I'm going to get back to that later in the video. A little tangent about the different codecs here. I'm going to have a video that is specifically about the file sizes as well as similar things and quality levels with the Canon EOS R, and that is coming up in a couple of days. However, a couple of things that I want to note here. The ProRes LT is actually quite similar in file size as the All-I codec that Canon has built in. However, the ProRes LT is still much nicer to edit with on the computer. So the editing program that you choose probably runs much smoother on ProRes LT, at least it does for my editing workflow with Adobe Premiere Pro. However, for the ProRes 4:2, the normal profile as well as the HQ profile, the file sizes are actually quite much bigger. For example, the HQ setting is about twice the size of the LT setting. Now, this may be okay for you depending on what you shoot and what benefits you want to get from this. However, you might also want to check whether or not it is actually worth recording in ProRes HQ versus LT, depending on what kind of color grade you work with. For my own use in the YouTube video making as well as the podcast recording, I'm pretty much sticking with ProRes LT because it gives me most of the benefits that I'm looking for with still having kind of reasonable file sizes available. So closing the section of codecs, you may have noticed that there is no H.264 or H.265, for example, for a compressed codec. This monitor really just gives you the recording of ProRes as well as DNxHR. So this is really good if you want those bigger files with more capabilities as well as workflow benefits. However, if you want to have those H.264 files or similar, you have to still record internally. As I mentioned, the LT version of ProRes is pretty much the same size as the All-I version. However, if you really want to go on the small side of the file size, you may still want to record in the IPB version of the codecs internally on the camera. However, then you have the problem of 30-minute runtime limits. Now jumping from codecs to frame rates, the Ninja V actually records up to 4K 60 FPS. However, that is not really something that I can test because the Canon EOS R does not output 4K 60. It's kind of a dream of mine that the Canon EOS R5 will actually have the output of 4K 60 full frame, and that would be a really nice pairing with that monitor to record the ProRes LT, ProRes HQ at 4K 60 to have that bandwidth and data rate as well as the quality level of C-Log and those things. It would just be really, really nice. But basically, the monitor just records whatever the camera outputs as long as it is under 4K 60. So for example, with the EOS R, you can output the 24 FPS in 1080p as well as 4K. It will record exactly that. And even though there is a setting on the Atomos Ninja V, I can't change it there, at least not with this camera. It may be possible to do that with other cameras, but for the most part, in my experience, the monitor records what is being output. And that also meant for me that it cannot record 4K even though I input a 1080p signal, or to scale it down, I cannot record a 1080p version of my 4K signal. It's just not possible to change that. But it also kind of makes sense that it's that way. You output a signal from your camera and the recorder just records whatever signal it gets. And then we have the benefit of recording to a SSD. This means two distinct benefits. Number one is that the SSDs are actually much cheaper than SD cards. For example, I got a 500 gigabyte drive for this recorder, and that cost me about 50 euros. For that money, I'm probably not even getting 64 gigabytes of high-speed SD cards that can handle the 4K 30 FPS, for example. So the storage that you can use with this recorder is much cheaper than using SD cards. And these SSDs are actually also quite much faster than the SD cards, for example, for offloading footage with these adapters rather than any kind of card reader. What you can also do, which is not really possible with SD cards, is you can plug your drive into your computer with an adapter like this, and you can straight up work from the SSD. And this is actually something that I've used quite a lot now because I can record, I have the editing program open, I can just drag and drop the files in there, and I still leave them on the SSD because it doesn't really matter where they are, and they're just fast enough to do that. The last benefit I want to touch on are the audio recording capabilities. Number one is that the audio inside of ProRes is actually higher quality than the audio in, for example, the IPB files or the ALL-I files. What I found with the audio recording is basically this. If you record 1080p 24 frames per second internally with the Canon EOS R into the H.264 file, you get a compressed file, which is a AAC codec for the audio compression. All the other things are pretty much the same. It's a stereo signal, it's 48 kilohertz. If you record the 4K version internally with the Canon EOS R, you get an uncompressed 2s audio file, which is basically a PCM uncompressed audio format, still stereo, 48 kilohertz and 32-bit in sample rate. However, now if you go through the HDMI port into the recorder, you actually get uncompressed PCM S24BE in 24. So that for me basically means that the ProRes actually has kind of like a WAV file, an uncompressed audio file, which is much higher quality than if I were to record internally. And maybe even the bigger benefit of the recorder here is that it actually gives you another line input or a mic input, so you can actually use up to 4 channels of recording. And that is actually quite nice because, for example, I can use an on-camera microphone like the Rode Video Mic NTG and plug that into the camera. It goes into the recorder through the HDMI port, and then I can also have a second microphone plugged into the monitor itself. And with the use of a little cable like this, for example, which is a stereo breakout cable, I can actually not only plug in one microphone, I can actually plug in up to 2 microphones, where this one is the left channel, and then this one is the right channel. So I have up to 3 different microphones, and if I use 2 of those and use them with the camera as well, I have up to 4 different microphones that are all recorded into separate channels, and that I really like because it makes this whole setup quite powerful. And one more thing that I want to mention is that this actually is also a expandable setup. So the recorder actually has a high-speed extension port inside of the battery hub, so you can plug something in, for example, for timecode syncing and also NDI streaming. Those are not really cheap, however, they may give you the functionality that you need for your setup to be able to, for example, do a live streaming or timecode syncing on a set. This is not really something that I'm currently worried about or working with, but I have seen certain modules that are quite interesting for all kinds of different setups. And one big thing that I actually noticed is when you do timecode syncing with one of those extensions, they also have a inbuilt battery, which gives you the ability to hot swap batteries while you are using the monitor. Apparently Additionally, the timecode module actually gives you about 7 minutes of runtime at 4K 60, so you have plenty of time to swap out the batteries in the back while you are still recording or using the monitor and having the whole setup still running. Now, this video is probably going to get quite long and out of hand. However, I still want to talk about my main reasons why I purchased this, the quirks that I found, as well as the things that I would like to be different, and a little bit of a conclusion as well. So please stay with me, and if this is all helpful for you, please also leave a comment down below so I can make sure to get back to you and maybe answer some questions or something like that. Main reasons why I purchased this monitor. The number one reason was the longer recording times. I don't want to have to worry about whether or not the monitor is still recording. I want to do interviews that are longer than 30 minutes and not worry about restarting the camera or interrupting the conversation. And also for my settings here in the studio, I like to do longer takes and just record continuously as long as it takes for me to make this video, even if I have to retake or something like that. For all of those purposes, the more than 30 minutes recording is really, really helpful. And I know I could get a different camera that can actually do that. However, I really like the package that I get with the Canon EOS R, with the flip screen, the lens mount, the compact form factor, the video, as well as the photo capabilities. And I was willing to make that investment to be able to do those things with this monitor and also have benefits down the line with other features. The scopes, as well as the waveform and those kind of things, are actually something that I quite underestimated how important and useful they might become. However, in the process of learning about them, I'm now also using them in the grading process more and more. And now it's really something that when I use this camera without the scopes and without the external monitor, I'm actually quite missing them. And I wish that in some future version of the Canon EOS R, for example, Canon would actually include something like that. The zebras, the waveforms, maybe even a vector scope or false color. All of those would be really, really helpful. And not only is the recording part improved, but I'm also noticing a strong improvement in the workflow after I have recorded everything in the editing department. Now recording ProRes LT, I get much better performance out of my 2017 MacBook Pro, which is pretty much spec'd out in terms of the processor as well as the graphics card and RAM. Like, those things are already there, and I noticed with the All-I as well as the IPB compression from the Canon EOS R files, I'm noticing much more frame drops. I'm noticing that playback is not as smooth, and with the ProRes files, it's much, much better. However, I don't have any of the recoding or encoding process of converting those H.264 files to ProRes, so that is really, really handy. But none of these gear items ever come without their quirks, and some of them that I already mentioned above are the start and stop the recording with the internal record button from the Canon EOS R, for example, only lets you record about 30 minutes. So you have to be aware of that and really make sure that when you are recording something that you want to do for longer than 30 minutes, you have to use the record button on the Atomos Ninja V, and you also have to change the settings inside of the camera to not shut off after a given time, because it's not actively recording. It thinks that it's not being used. So make sure you make those settings to actually be able to use that recording more than 30 minutes ability. And then there's one thing that I actually sent Atomos an email about as a feature request, and that's about the audio input. The audio input on the Atomos Ninja V is not necessarily synchronized with the HDMI input. And this makes sense because the signal that's coming from the HDMI port of your camera has much more processing done to it than, for example, sending in a normal audio signal just into the Atomos Ninja V. There's a trick to that, which is the audio frame delay, so that you can actually make sure that those things are in sync. However, that frame delay means that all of the audio is pushed, which also means that if you're recording HDMI audio as well as an extra microphone, those are then off axis again. From my own testing right now, I have found that when I'm using a microphone and plugging it into the Atomos Ninja V directly, I have to set the audio frame delay to 3 frames. However, the issue then becomes that the audio going through the HDMI port is then 3 frames too early. So it's not really quite easy to get those all aligned. And you might want to do your own testing with some clapping, for example, to see how many frames your audio is off depending on what you're using there. I emailed Atomos about this and asked if they can implement a frame delay for the different audio channels so we can have the audio from the HDMI port and the audio from the line input actually have different frame set delays. And they answered that they're going to have that on the feature request list, and I'm just crossing my fingers that they will implement that in the next update from the Atomos OS. So going over to the things that I would like to be different. Number one is that it would be nice to have the ability to just plug in a USB-C type SSD, for example. These SATA 3 SSDs are nice, they're quite cheap and all that, but it would be a quite nice addition to have a USB-C port on this device, for example, for the use with a USB-C type stick or USB-C type SSD, like the Blackmagic cameras, for example. I also would say that the fans of the Atomos Ninja V are a little bit louder than I would like them to be, and the whole device also gets a little warmer than I would like to. However, those are also things that are probably coming from just the sheer amount of tech that is in there, and also the ability to bring all the brightness to the monitor, which kind of makes the whole cooling necessary. Then I also had the idea that it would be quite nice if this recorder actually could record ProRes proxy files, for example, in 720p, just in parallel to what it is already recording internally. Now, I understand that it may not be able to kind of like convert that on the fly at the same time, but it would be a nice addition to be able to use those in the editing process without having to recreate them in the meantime or have some kind of a conversion process and just have them ready off the go. And that could really help in the processing of bigger data files and also quality settings. For example, working with 4K recordings or 4K 60 even on a laptop when I'm traveling. And then a small thing that I didn't quite get before I bought this is that this device actually does not have a speaker, or at least I haven't found how to use it. You actually have to plug in headphones to be able to replay anything and hear what you are talking or the sound that you're recording. So without headphones or some kind of a speaker that you are connecting to the Atomos Ninja V, you don't hear anything that you have recorded. And I would have just enjoyed if there's a small type of speaker, and it doesn't really have to be high quality, but it would have been nice to just be able to make sure that there is sound, and especially when I'm talking about something, I might want to just check what I've said. A couple more nitpicky things is that the shutoff takes 4 seconds of holding the shutoff button, which is already retracted into the housing and kind of makes this whole thing a little bit inconvenient, I would say. It's hardly a problem, but sometimes a little bit of annoying. A more important part, though, is the display of the timecode. And there's actually a very specific thing that I would love to see in the interface, which is number one, that the timecode from the camera could be recorded, but what I'm seeing is the recording duration, or maybe have that as an additional thing on the screen. Because for me, it's quite interesting to know for how long I've been recording, but if I'm also using the timecode from the camera, so I actually record when the recording started and at what time it actually ended. So to use that, I then only see that as well. And then so I have to really be careful to know when did I hit the record button and for how long have I been recording. And so the only way that I have found to actually use that functionality is when I set the timecode settings to reset with every take. And then I see the recording duration on the screen, and it's also written into the metadata. However, the metadata then always says that the start of the timecode is 100 something. So that would be really helpful if I could see the recording duration and the timecode on the screen, and also have the real timecode be recorded and the duration be displayed on the monitor. And the last thing that I wrote down was that I would love to see the waveform as well as the vector scope at the same time on the monitor without having to switch between them. However, one way to see exposure and color data at the same time is to activate the false color and also use the vector scope at the same time. Those do work, but I would prefer waveform as well as vector scope. So my conclusion about this device, I'm really happy with my investment. It's not perfect, but none of the hardware devices that I own is perfect. It's never really completely everything that I would want it to be, but I am happy to have it. Could I do my videos without it? Certainly, but it makes my whole process much easier to have this available. Now the question would probably be, is the Atomos Ninja V for you? And I would say you have to know this for yourself depending on your use case. Do you need a bigger monitor? Do you want to have a monitor that you can mount somewhere off your camera? Do you have a camera with a flippy screen? Or do you want to add that to a camera that does not have that functionality? Do you want to have the easier workflow with the ProRes files, for example, to have smoother playback as well as editing in that form? Or do you want to have the longer longer recording times of more than 30 minutes because your normal camera doesn't give you that. All of those are pretty good reasons next to the analytical features, the brightness, and those kind of things. So you really have to make sure if that is for you. At the end of the day, it's a quite expensive investment. However, it's also an investment that feels like it could be something worth in the future because, for example, this camera right now does not record 4K 60. The next camera may do that. And also, maybe the Canon EOS R5 can output ProRes RAW, and then I can actually record that, even though it would mean hell of a lot of data to process and bigger drives to buy. Now, I'm going to talk about more of these different codecs as well as storage needed for storing all of that information in the next video coming up when I'm talking about the pairing between the Canon EOS R and the Atomos Ninja V. So stay tuned for that video. I hope this video was information rich for you and you learned something about the Atomos Ninja V, or it made your purchasing decision a little easier. Now, please leave any questions or feedback in the comment section down below, and I'm trying to make sure to answer those as quickly as possible. With all that said, and your head probably spinning a little bit, just as mine, I will see you in the next video, and I hope you have an amazing day. Ciao, ciao!